cursed doll. In a small town, lost among endless fields, there lived a girl named Lucy. She had always dreamed of a doll that would become her best friend. On her 10th birthday, her dream came true. Her grandmother gave her an antique doll with long, flowing hair and bright, expressive eyes. The doll was elegantly dressed in a fluffy dress, and its face radiated kindness and innocence. "Be careful with it," her grandmother said softly, watching as Lucy hugged the doll excitedly. "This doll has a story of its own." Lucy didn't pay much attention to that. She sat down on the floor, smoothed the doll's skirt, and began to play. With each passing day, the doll became more and more a part of her life. Lucy named her Mila, and they spent long hours together playing various games. But one day, when Lucy woke up in the morning, she noticed that Mila was standing at the edge of her bed. Although she had left her sitting on the shelf, Lucy's heart began to race. "Mila, you were just on the shelf!" Lucy exclaimed. But the doll only stared at her silently. At first, Lucy thought it was just her imagination, but soon, other strange things began to happen. Mila not only changed positions, but also whispered to her at night when Lucy couldn't sleep. It was as if someone behind her was calling her name. The girl felt fear, but at the same time, she was drawn to the mystery. Days passed, and Lucy noticed that when she played with Mila, the doll started giving her suggestions on what to do. These were not just game tips, they were dangerous ideas. "Jump off the bed," or "show everyone what you can do," it whispered. Captivated by a strange excitement, Lucy obeyed. Her behavior became increasingly odd, and her parents began to worry about her well-being. One day, while playing with Mila outside, Lucy saw the doll slowly turn its head towards her friends. Terror gripped her when she realized that the doll was indeed watching them. The girl recoiled in panic, but Mila kept moving, even though Lucy didn't touch her. "Mila, this isn't funny!" she shouted, but the doll merely smirked with its silent face. After that, Lucy couldn't sleep. Every night, she heard the doll whispering in her ear, as if it knew that the girl was afraid of her. One day, unable to bear it any longer, she decided to take Mila back to her grandmother, hoping that she would know how to rid her of this nightmare. "Grandma, Mila is scaring me," Lucy said tearfully when she arrived at her grandmother's house. Her grandmother, hearing about the strange occurrences with the doll, frowned and asked Lucy to show her. When the girl returned with the doll, her grandmother examined it closely. She suddenly turned pale. "This doll, it belonged to a girl who went missing many years ago," the grandmother said quietly. "They say her spirit lives in it. And if we don't stop this, it could take you with it." Lucy felt a chill of terror as the doll began to tremble in her hands. She tried to break free, but the doll held her tightly. "We must perform a ritual to free her soul," her grandmother continued, gathering old candles and amulets. "You must be brave." Night fell, and the grandmother prepared everything for the ritual. Lucy stood before a mirror with the doll, her heart racing. The grandmother began to chant an incantation, and the room suddenly grew cold. The doll began to stir, seeming even more sinister. "I don't want to leave," it screamed piercingly, and its voice sounded like something other than a child's. At that moment, Lucy realized that she herself had to help this unfortunate soul. She closed her eyes and, gathering all her courage, recited the words she had heard from her grandmother. She knew she had to free the spirit of the girl bound to the doll, despite her fear. Suddenly, the room filled with bright light, and the doll quivered, as if it were fighting against an invisible force. "Forgive me," Lucy cried, feeling tears streaming down her cheeks. "I want to help you." Suddenly, a piercing scream filled the air, and the doll went limp, losing its evil power. Lucy felt the light enveloping her, and then silence. The doll no longer moved. It was just a doll, lifeless and powerless. Lucy stood trembling, but felt an incredible sense of relief. She no longer felt fear. Her grandmother approached and hugged her, sighing with relief. "You were very brave, Lucy," her grandmother said, and the girl knew she would never be afraid again. The cursed doll remained in the past, and Lucy could finally return to her normal life. However, in the darkness of the room, The doll lay on the floor, its bright eyes still staring into nothingness, as if waiting for its next victim. The Cursed Room. This story began when I moved to a small town and got a job as a receptionist at an old hotel. It stood on the outskirts, surrounded by forest, and, according to the locals, had been there for over 100 years. The hotel was beautiful, but seemed oddly empty and a bit gloomy. My main duty was to check in guests and ensure everything ran smoothly. The job seemed simple enough, until one day, the owner, Mr. Crawford, gave me a strange warning: never let anyone stay in room 217. His words puzzled me, but I didn't ask any questions. I assumed the room was under renovation. A few weeks later, I noticed that guests occasionally asked about room 217. They claimed they had seen light coming from its window or heard footsteps inside, as if someone was staying there. But whenever I checked the floor, the room was always locked and everything was silent. One evening, while I was alone in the hotel, strange noises started coming from the third floor, right where room 217 was located. I stepped out of my office and went upstairs. The hallway was dark, but a faint light seeped out from under the door of room 217. It was impossible. Only I had the keys to that room. I knocked. There was no answer. As I turned to leave, the door creaked open slightly. Inside, the room looked ordinary. A bed, a wardrobe, a small table. But the atmosphere was strange, as if the air was colder and heavier than in the rest of the hotel. On the table lay an old book, its pages yellowed and filled with handwritten text. I opened it. The book contained notes about a guest who had stayed there many years ago. The entries described how the room absorbs the soul and makes people see terrifying dreams. The final entry was short: "I can't take it anymore. If you found this, don't stay here." A chill ran down my spine. Closing the book, I left the room and locked the door. But from that moment on, even stranger things began to happen in the hotel. Despite Mr. Crawford's warnings, one day a man arrived who insisted on staying in room 217. He looked like an ordinary tourist, but spoke with a determination that made it seem as if he knew something about the room. "I've heard the stories about this room," he said when I tried to dissuade him. "Don't worry, I'm not afraid." In the end, I gave in and handed him the key. That night, I woke to a loud scream coming from the third floor. I rushed upstairs. As I approached the door to room 217, I heard noises, not just screams, but heavy breathing, as if several people were inside. I opened the door. The man was sitting on the floor, trembling and covering his face with his hands. The room looked different. The furniture was overturned, and strange symbols covered the walls, symbols that hadn't been there before. "Get out!" he shouted. "She won't let me go." I helped him to his feet and escorted him downstairs. That night, he left in a hurry, abandoning even his belongings. After this incident, I couldn't take it anymore and demanded an explanation from Mr. Crawford. He was silent for a long time before finally telling me the story of room 217. Many years ago, a family stayed at the hotel. Their 10-year-old daughter, Emily, vanished under mysterious circumstances. She'd been playing in her room and simply disappeared, leaving behind only drawings, which were later found on the walls. Since then, strange events had plagued the room. People said her spirit remained there, luring others to keep her company. "I've tried to close off the room forever," Mr. Crawford admitted, "but something won't let me." I decided it was time to put an end to this story. Taking the book I had found in room 217, I studied it carefully. One entry mentioned that the curse could be broken if the spirit was given what it wanted most. I brought a doll into the room, a doll like the one described by those who had seen Emily in life. Placing it on the bed, I said, "Emily, you're free, go home." At first, nothing happened, but then I felt the air in the room grow lighter. The doll fell to the floor, and a child's laugh echoed outside the window before fading away. From that day on, room 217 caused no more trouble. It was finally reopened to guests and became just an ordinary, unremarkable room. Yet sometimes, as I pass by its door, I still hear faint laughter, as if someone is thanking me for helping them find peace. The noise behind the wall. My name is Mike, and I never believed in paranormal phenomena. I was always amused by ghost stories, demons, and anything that fell beyond ordinary human understanding. But one day, I encountered something that turned my life upside down. It happened last fall, when I moved into a small, dilapidated house on the edge of a town where few people seemed to stick around. The house was old, yes, but the rent was ridiculously low. And since I had recently been laid off, I decided to save money on rent and live in solitude until I found a new place. All the previous tenants had left shortly after moving in, which made me think there was something wrong with the house. But I figured it was just superstition. It all started with a strange noise behind the wall. On the first night, when I had settled into the bedroom and lay down in bed, I heard some odd sound. It came from the wall against which my bed was placed. At first, I thought it was old pipes or rats, but the sound was different. It resembled a barely audible whisper, something like a human voice, only unclear and muffled, as if someone was trying to speak words but couldn't. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Besides, I was tired and jittery after moving in. So the next day, when I returned from work, I just forgot about it. But the noise repeated. Only this time, it was clearer. Listening closely, I realized that the sounds were coming not only from the bedroom, but also from other rooms. This started happening every night. As soon as I lay down to sleep, strange noises would start behind the wall, turning into a quiet, barely distinguishable whisper. Soon, I stopped sleeping, because at night, when I closed my eyes, I could hear something whispering words to me. Sometimes, it seemed there were pleas and entreaties in these sounds, and other times, a chilling, bone-freezing laugh. One night, unable to bear this horror any longer, I got up from bed, grabbed a flashlight, and walked along the wall from where the sound was coming. I wanted to check if there was a hole there, or maybe some mechanism creating the sound, but I found nothing. In utter desperation, I knocked on the wall, hoping. I don't know what I was hoping for, but instead of silence, I heard a distinct echo, as if something on the other side of the wall responded to me. My heart began to race, and that night I barely slept. The next day, I called the landlord and asked if there had been any complaints about strange noises before. He paused for a moment and then advised me to ignore it. He assured me that it was just an old building and the sounds were perfectly explainable, but there was something unsettling in his voice. It seemed like he knew more than he was letting on. That night, I lay down again with the thought that it was just my imagination, that I was simply too impressionable. I had almost fallen asleep when a noise made me jump up. It wasn't a whisper this time, but a knock. A knock that sounded like desperate pounding against the wall. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was as if someone on the other side of the wall was struggling, trying to break through. I didn't know what to do. Should I just run? But run where? I didn't have money for other housing, and making a fuss over sounds seemed foolish. A few more days passed, and I got used to the noise, or rather, I accepted it. The sounds were constant, but I began to ignore them. After all, it was just an old house. However, I soon started noticing something else. Things in the house began moving on their own. The new knives I'd just bought suddenly disappeared in the kitchen. The books on the shelf were turned upside down, although I knew I hadn't touched them. Everything reached a peak when, one night, I woke up with a feeling that someone was watching me. I opened my eyes and saw a dark figure standing by the door. At first, I thought it was just a play of shadows, but then the figure took a step toward me. I was paralyzed with fear, unable even to scream. The figure approached close enough for me to make out its face. It was blurry, but eerily familiar. It was my own face, only distorted with fear and malice. The figure stood at the edge of the bed, and I felt an icy chill piercing me to the bone. Suddenly, the figure whispered, Help me!" in a voice that seemed both mine and foreign at the same time. I didn't understand what was happening, but the nightmares didn't end there. When I woke up in the morning, I was convinced it was just a dream, but there was a pair of wet footprints on the floor by my bed, and on the wall, I saw words written in something sticky and dark. "They are coming for you." I grabbed my phone and called the landlord, but his number didn't answer. I decided I couldn't stay there another second. I packed my things and ran out of the house. As soon as I left the property, I felt a strange sense of relief, but the unease still lingered. Later, I found out that the house I had lived in belonged to a family that had disappeared under mysterious circumstances many years ago. People say that no one could stay there for long since then. People heard strange noises, saw silhouettes, and everyone who tried to live in that house left in terror. Now, when I look back, I think that the whisper and strange figures were something real, something that tried to tell me about the terrible fate of those who had lived there before me. And sometimes, when I fall asleep, I dream that I'm once again walking down that empty hallway, with barely audible whispers behind the wall. Help me. The house on the cliff. I grew up in a small seaside town where everyone knew each other. Our town was quiet and cozy, but it had one peculiar feature: a tall cliff overlooking the raging sea. At its very edge stood an old, abandoned house. No one had lived there for decades, and locals called it the Cursed House. There were countless rumors about the house. Some said a man who once lived there had mysteriously disappeared. Others claimed that anyone who entered the house was never seen again. But I was always curious about what truly lay behind its crooked walls. One day, I was walking home after school. The wind whipped dark clouds across the sea, and I decided to take a shortcut along the path leading to the cliff. As I passed the house, I thought I saw a light flickering in one of its windows. Probably just my imagination, I told myself, but a strange feeling lingered. I stopped and stared at the window. There was definitely movement inside. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but my curiosity outweighed my fear. I stepped closer. Inside, the house was dark, but I could see a faint, shadowy figure moving near the window. "Hey!" I called out. There was no response. The next day, I couldn't shake the thought of what I'd seen. I told my best friend, Mark, about it. He was just as curious as I was, and immediately suggested we go there together. "Maybe someone's squatting there," he said. "Let's check it out." We agreed to meet that evening, armed with flashlights and pocket knives, just in case. We made our way to the house. As we approached, I felt a chill emanating from its crumbling walls. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting us in. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Mark asked, noticing my hesitation. "Of course," I replied, masking my fear. Inside, the house was even gloomier than it looked from outside. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet, and the air was damp and heavy. The walls were covered in mold, but old portraits still hung on them. One of them depicted a man in a long coat with a stern expression. "That must be the guy who used to live here," Mark muttered. We ventured further into the house. In the back, we found a staircase leading to the basement. From below, we could hear a faint sound, almost like whispering. "Do you hear that?" Mark asked. I nodded. The sound grew louder, resembling a voice repeating the same phrase. "Help me." We descended into the basement. There, in the center of the room, stood an old, dusty chest. The whispers seemed to be coming from inside it. "Do we open it?" Mark asked quietly. I nodded. When we opened the chest, we found an old journal inside. The whispers stopped the moment we touched it. The cover bore a name, Richard Carter. We began to read. The journal described how Richard had lived in the house many years ago. He wrote about a curse that had fallen upon the house, mentioning voices that called to him from the cliff. The final entry was haunting. "If you found this, please don't let the house claim another life. Burn this journal and the curse will be lifted." A cold chill ran down my spine as I read the words. We hurried out of the house, taking the journal with us. Outside, the wind picked up, howling fiercely, as if the house didn't want us to leave. The walls groaned ominously, and the front door slammed shut behind us, as though trying to trap us inside. We ran to the edge of the cliff and built a small fire. As I lit the pages of the journal, I felt a heavy weight lift from the air. The wind suddenly calmed, and in the distance we heard a faint whisper, but this time it sounded grateful. "Thank you." The next day, the house looked different. Its walls no longer loomed menacingly, and the windows were empty of any flickering shadows. Locals said the place felt calmer now. Mark and I decided never to go back. Still, sometimes I pass by the house and feel as though someone is watching from the window, not with malice, but with warmth, as if thanking us for breaking the curse that had haunted it for so long. The shadow in the mirror. When I started my new job at an old library, I couldn't have imagined that I would become part of such a strange story. The library was located in the centre of a small town and had been built over 100 years ago. Its walls carried the weight of time, ancient wooden shelves, dusty books, and massive windows that let in sunlight only during the day. One of my responsibilities was to clean up the reading hall after closing. That's when I first noticed the mirror in the far corner of the library. It was tall, with a massive gilded frame, and seemed completely out of place in the otherwise modest interior. "Why is this here?" I asked Mrs. Fletcher, the librarian who had been working there for decades. She hesitated, avoiding looking at the mirror, and answered shortly, "It's part of the library's history, just don't touch it." One evening, while I was alone, I had the eerie sensation that someone was watching me. Turning around, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror. It wasn't my reflection. I stepped closer to take a better look. My face stared back at me, as expected, but behind me in the mirror was a figure, a tall silhouette standing in the corner of the room. I spun around, but no one was there. Probably just my imagination, I thought, trying to brush it off. But forgetting about it proved to be impossible. With each passing evening, the occurrences grew stranger. Shelves near the mirror were mysteriously disordered by mourning, and books were scattered on the floor, even though I had left everything in perfect order. One night, I heard whispers coming from the corner, but again, no one was there. I told Mrs. Fletcher about what I'd noticed, but she simply shook her head. "The mirror is old," she said. "Sometimes it shows things you'd rather not see." Her words unsettled me. I decided to dig deeper into its mystery. In the library's archives, I found a mention of a woman named Annabelle, who had worked there almost a century ago. People said she was obsessed with the mirror, spending hours in front of it, as though she saw something no one else could. One day, Annabelle vanished without a trace. All that remained were the drawings and notes she had left behind, scattered around the mirror. Since then, strange occurrences had been attributed to the mirror. Some believed her spirit was trapped inside it. Others said the mirror revealed hidden truths about those who stood before it. One evening, I decided to stay after hours and confront whatever was happening. Standing before the mirror, I gazed at my reflection. At first, everything appeared normal, but after a few seconds, I saw the silhouette again behind me. I asked aloud, "Is someone there? Who are you?" A faint message began to appear on the glass, as though written by an invisible hand. "Help me." A chill ran down my spine, but I didn't run away. Instead, I whispered, "How can I help you?" The shadow in the mirror began to shift, and I could make out the face of a young woman. It was Annabelle. She looked at me with pleading eyes, though her lips didn't move. In one of the archives, I had found an old note stating that the mirror was created to seal away painful memories. It occurred to me that Annabelle might have been trapped by her own fears or sorrow. I brought a candle and an ancient book of incantations I had found in the library. According to the text, a spirit could be freed by forgiving oneself or someone who had caused pain. Standing before the mirror, I said, "Annabelle, you are free. Forgive yourself." For a moment, the mirror glowed softly before dimming again. I watched as her image faded away, and the air in the room seemed to lighten. After that night, the mirror became ordinary. No one heard whispers or saw shadows again. Sometimes I glance at it in the corner and remember Annabelle, knowing I helped her find peace. The library returned to its usual quiet, but the mirror remains a reminder that even in the strangest objects, we can find stories worth telling.